Monica Stewart had 15 minutes before security would escort her out. Fired. Disgraced. Done. She was wiping down her station when the thunder started, except it wasn't thunder. Helicopters. Military. Two of them, dropping fast onto the hospital roof, reaching down. Chaos erupted. Administrators screamed into phones. Soldiers in tactical gear flooded the hallways, searching faces, shouting a name. Her name. "We have a code black situation," the ranking officer announced to the frozen crowd. "We need the medic from Basra, the one who saved Falcon 9. Monica's blood ran cold. That mission was classified. Erased. She wasn't supposed to exist. So how did they find her? And why now? Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. Monica Stewart stood in Director Richard Pemberton's office at 20 minutes past 6 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's scrubs. The fabric clung to her shoulders, damp with the kind of sweat that comes from 8 straight hours of keeping people alive. Her hair had long since escaped its tie, and there was a coffee stain on her left sleeve she didn't remember getting. Pemberton sat behind his mahogany desk, hands folded like a man delivering a sermon. Between them lay a single folder with her name typed across the tab. "Your instincts don't override hospital protocol, Miss Stewart." His voice was measured, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Monica didn't respond. She simply stood there, feet planted, watching him arrange his words like chess pieces. The city was beginning to wake up beyond the windows. Dawn light crept across downtown, painting the glass towers in shades of amber and rose. It would have been beautiful if she'd had the energy to notice. "We have procedures for a reason," he continued, tapping the folder with one finger. "Chain of command. Consultation. Documentation. You bypassed all of it." She could feel the words building in her chest, the defense she could mount, the argument she could win. But she'd learned something in her years wearing different uniforms and different names. Some battles aren't fought in the open. Some you lose the moment you start explaining yourself. So she said nothing. Pemberton cleared his throat, uncomfortable with her silence. He was used to people defending themselves, pleading their cases, offering promises to do better. Monica just looked at him with those steady gray eyes that had seen far worse than a hospital administrator with a god complex. "The incident report says you performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without authorization, without the attending surgeon present, without proper imaging." His voice gained an edge. "Do you understand the liability exposure you created for this hospital?" "The patient lived," Monica said quietly. It was the first thing she'd spoken since entering his office. Her voice was hoarse from a night of calling orders across a chaotic emergency department. "The patient lived, and if I'd waited for proper imaging and authorization and the attending surgeon to finish his morning coffee, she'd be in the morgue right now." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. The point is that medicine is not practiced on instinct, Miss Stewart. It's practiced according to evidence-based guidelines and institutional protocols. What you call instinct, I call recklessness." Monica's mind drifted back to the night before, to the moment when everything crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. The woman had been brought in by ambulance, crushing chest pain radiating down her left arm, blood pressure plummeting despite maximum pressor support. The cardiology fellow had ordered another echocardiogram, insisting they needed better visualization before making any invasive moves. Monica had watched the monitor, watched the woman's eyes beginning to lose focus, watched the jugular vein distending in her neck like a rope pulled too tight. She'd seen this before. Not in this hospital, not in this country, but in places where hesitation meant death and protocols were written in sand. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the sac around the heart, squeezing it like a fist until it couldn't beat anymore. The woman had maybe 3 minutes before her heart stopped entirely. The fellow was still adjusting the ultrasound probe, muttering about acoustic windows and image quality. Monica had made a decision that took less than a heartbeat. She'd grabbed the thoracentesis kit from the crash cart, prepped the woman's chest with betadine in 3 quick swipes, and felt for the angle between the 4th and 5th ribs. The needle had to go in at exactly the right spot, exactly the right angle, threading between bone and lung and major vessels to reach the pericardial space. Too shallow, and she'd hit nothing. Too deep, and she'd puncture the heart itself. She'd done it without imaging, without backup, without permission. just her fingers reading the landscape of the woman's chest, and her memory supplying the map. The needle had found its mark. Dark blood had rushed into the syringe, 60 milliliters of fluid that had been choking the life out of the woman's heart. Within seconds, the blood pressure had started climbing. The monitor had stopped alarming. The woman had gasped, her eyes suddenly focusing again, finding Monica's face and holding it like an anchor. "You're okay," Monica had whispered, keeping her hand steady on the needle. "You're going to be okay." That's when the attending surgeon had arrived, taking in the scene with a face like thunderclouds. That's when the fellow had stopped fumbling with the ultrasound and started documenting everything Monica had done. That's when she'd known this conversation with Pemberton was inevitable. "Reckless," she repeated now, testing the word in Pemberton's office. "Is that what we're calling it when someone survives?" The director stood up, signaling that the conversation was reaching its conclusion. "Mrs. Patterson is alive, yes, and we're grateful for that. But gratitude doesn't change the fact that you violated multiple hospital policies, created enormous legal risk, and demonstrated a pattern of behavior that suggests you don't believe the rules apply to you. This isn't the first time you've gone off protocol, Miss Stewart. It's simply the most dramatic." He opened the folder, revealing a termination letter already prepared, already signed. "I'm letting you go, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay, and we'll accept your resignation for personal reasons. You'll surrender your badge and any hospital property before you leave the building." Monica looked at the letter, at her name printed in clean corporate font above the words "immediate termination." She thought about arguing, about pointing out that Patterson's family would be planning a funeral right now if she'd followed protocol. But Pemberton's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about medicine. It was about control. It was about a system protecting itself from people who made their own decisions. She'd seen this before too. Different building, different uniform, different reasons. But the same fundamental truth. Institutions didn't reward people who broke ranks to do what was right. They punished them as examples. Monica reached for the letter, her hand steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. "Where do I turn in my badge?" she asked. Pemberton blinked, surprised again by her lack of resistance. "Security desk on the first floor. They'll have an exit checklist for you." He paused, seeming to search for something appropriate to say. "For what it's worth, Miss Stewart, you're a talented nurse. Perhaps in a different setting, one with more flexibility, you'd find a better fit." "Perhaps," Monica said. She folded the termination letter once, twice, and slid it into the pocket of her scrubs. Then she walked out of his office, down the administrative corridor with its motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, past the nurse's station where her colleagues were beginning another shift. A few of them looked at her, questions in their eyes, but Monica kept walking. Down the stairs to the locker room, down the long hallway toward the exit, out into the morning that was still painting the city in light. She'd been fired for saving a life. If you've ever been punished for doing the right thing, for trusting what you knew to be true even when everyone else said to wait, to follow the rules, to let the system work, then you understand what Monica felt in that moment. Not anger, not even surprise. Just a quiet, bone-deep weariness with a world that called courage recklessness and survival a liability. Drop a comment saying I stood my ground. Because what happens next proves that sometimes the system gets it wrong. And sometimes the people it throws away are exactly the ones it needs most. Monica pushed through the hospital's front doors into the cool morning air. She had no idea that in less than an hour, the sky would split open with the sound of helicopters. She had no idea that the past she'd buried was about to claw its way back into the light. All she knew was that she'd done her job, saved a life, and lost everything because of it. Some battles, she'd learned, aren't won with words. Some you carry in silence until the world finally understands what you already knew. She just didn't know yet that her silence was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. Monica had asked for one last walk through the hospital before she left. Pemberton had agreed, probably out of guilt, though he'd assigned a security guard to shadow her from a distance. She didn't mind. There were people she needed to see, goodbyes that mattered more than the anger of an administrator who'd never understood what it meant to hold someone's life in your hands. The night shift had that particular quality of silence that only exists in hospitals at 3 in the morning. Not true quiet, never that, but a kind of hushed reverence. Machines hummed their steady rhythms. Occasional footsteps echoed down corridors. Somewhere a patient coughed, and somewhere else a nurse murmured reassurance. Monica moved through it like a ghost, and maybe that's what she was now. Already gone, just waiting for her body to catch up with the reality. She found Maria Rodriguez in the cardiac unit, charting at the nurse's station under the blue glow of computer screens. Maria looked up, saw Monica's face, and understood immediately. No, she breathed. They didn't. Monica managed a small smile. They did. Maria came around the desk and pulled her into a hug that smelled like antiseptic and the vanilla lotion she always kept in her pocket. You saved that woman's life, she whispered fiercely. Everyone knows it. Monica held her friend for a moment, then pulled back. Make sure Patterson gets her medication on time, okay? The transition to the oral anticoagulant is tricky. Maria nodded, tears in her eyes. I'll watch her myself. Monica left notes at 3 other patient rooms. Small things, observations that wouldn't make it into official charts, but mattered anyway. Mr. Chun in 412 got anxious around shift change, needed extra reassurance. Mrs. Okoye in 420 preferred her pain medication 30 minutes before physical therapy. Little fragments of knowledge that made the difference between treating a condition and caring for a person. She folded each note and left them at the nurse's station, gifts for whoever would inherit her patients. Mercy Heights knew Monica the nurse. They knew her efficiency, her calm under pressure, her uncanny ability to spot problems before they became crises. What they didn't know was where that instinct came from. Nobody knew Monica the combat medic. Nobody knew about the desert that had taught her to read the space between heartbeats, to feel the wrongness in a patient's breathing, to make decisions when there was no time for committees or protocols or second opinions. She'd learned medicine in places where hesitation meant death, where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away and the helicopters didn't always come, where you had a trauma kit and your training and nothing else between a wounded soldier and a flag-draped coffin. That's where she'd learned to trust her hands, to trust the knowledge that lived deeper than textbooks. And that's why she'd become a nurse in the first place. Her brother Danny had been 17 when the car accident happened. Rural highway, drunk driver, 40 minutes from the nearest emergency room. He'd bled out on the side of the road waiting for an ambulance that got lost trying to find them. Monica had been 15, holding his hand, watching the light leave his eyes while their mother screamed into a cell phone at a dispatcher who kept asking for landmarks on a road that had none. Danny had died because help came too late. Monica had decided that night that she would become the help that arrives in time. The military had seemed like the fastest path. They'd train her, deploy her, put her in situations where her skills would matter most. And they had. For 5 years, she'd been exactly what she'd wanted to be. The one who showed up. The one who knew what to do. The one who kept people alive until the real help arrived. But the military had also shown her things she wished she could forget, asked her to do things that still woke her up at night, and then thrown her away when she'd become inconvenient. So she'd become Monica Stewart, civilian nurse, and tried to leave the rest behind. Tried to pretend that the scars on her soul were old enough not to matter anymore. The staff lounge was empty when she reached it, just the coffee maker burbling to itself and the fluorescent lights humming overhead. On the far wall hung a memorial, a simple wooden frame containing photographs and names. Healthcare workers from Mercy Heights who'd died in the line of duty. 3 nurses who'd contracted infections from patients. 1 doctor killed in a car accident rushing to an emergency. 1 paramedic who'd died of a heart attack on scene. And 1 name that didn't belong. Monica stood in front of the memorial, reading names she'd memorized months ago, until her eyes found the one that made her breath catch. Captain Sarah Chun, M.D., United States Army. Died in service, Basra, Iraq. The photograph showed a young woman in dress uniform, bright smile, dark eyes full of certainty about the difference she was going to make in the world. Monica's hand rose, almost of its own accord, and touched the glass over Sarah's face. Sarah Chun had been her commanding officer. Sarah Chun had died in the ambush that Monica survived. And Sarah Chun's name wasn't supposed to be on any public memorial, because officially, that mission had never happened. The operation had been classified, buried, erased from every record that mattered. So how was her name here? Who had known to add it? Monica's heart began to beat faster, that old familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet. She touched one name in particular, a name that wasn't supposed to be there, a name that only 6 people in the world knew was real, and 5 of them had been at that ambush, which meant someone else knew. Someone had been watching. Someone had been keeping track of ghosts. Monica pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of how exposed she was, standing in an empty lounge at 3 in the morning with her fingerprints on a secret she'd thought was buried. The security guard was waiting in the hallway. The hospital was quiet. Everything seemed normal, but something had shifted, some invisible tripwire she hadn't known existed. She turned away from the memorial and walked toward the exit, moving a little faster now, suddenly eager to be gone from this place. She didn't know yet that she was already too late, that the past wasn't something you could outrun, that in just a few hours, the sky would open up and drag her back into a world she'd spent 8 years trying to forget. All she knew was that Sarah Chin's name shouldn't have been on that wall, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that someone wanted her to see it. Monica stood in front of her locker in the staff changing room, methodically removing the last remnants of her life at Mercy Heights. Her stethoscope, the good one with her name engraved on the bell. 3 pens, 2 black and 1 red. A small bottle of hand lotion. A photograph of Danny taped inside the locker door, his 17-year-old face frozen in permanent youth. She reached for it, careful not to bend the edges, when she heard the sound. Distant. Low. A rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thunder, maybe. Except the sky had been clear when she'd looked outside 10 minutes ago. The rumble grew louder, deeper, shaking through the building's bones. Monica's hands stopped moving. She knew that sound. Knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. The way certain memories live in your body instead of your mind. Around her, junior nurses looked up from their phones, confused. One of them laughed nervously. What is that, construction? The windows began to rattle in their frames. Not gently, violently, like something massive was pressing down on the entire building. The overhead lights flickered once, twice, and the emergency backup system kicked in with a whine. Monica's fingers had frozen on her bag zipper, her entire body gone still in a way that had nothing to do with conscious thought. This was muscle memory. This was the part of her that had learned to recognize threat by sound alone. Helicopters, but not medical transport, not news crews. These were military birds, and they were coming in fast and low, the kind of approach you made when you needed to own the airspace immediately. Monica's breath caught in her throat. She zipped her bag with hands that had started to shake, slinging it over her shoulder just as the first screams echoed from the upper floors. The hospital erupted into chaos with the speed of a building that had just realized it was under siege. Security guards ran past the locker room, shouting into radios. An automated announcement began playing over the loudspeaker system, that artificial calm voice that always sounds wrong during emergencies. All staff, please remain calm and await further instructions. Do not attempt to leave the building. This is not a drill. Monica stepped out into the hallway and immediately got swept up in a tide of confusion. Nurses were running toward patient rooms, faces tight with controlled panic. Someone was shouting about lockdown protocols. A doctor was demanding to know who authorized military aircraft to land on a civilian hospital. Through the windows at the end of the corridor, Monica could see them now. 2 Black Hawks, matte black and absolutely unmistakable, their rotors still spinning as they settled onto the hospital's rooftop helipad. These weren't search and rescue birds. These were combat transport. Fast insertion, fast extraction. The kind of helicopters that showed up when something had gone catastrophically wrong. Monica's heart was hammering now, her mind racing through possibilities and coming up empty. This didn't make sense. This couldn't be happening. She'd been careful. She'd stayed invisible. She'd buried her past so deep that no one should have been able to find her. The loudspeaker crackled again, and this time the voice was different. Human. Male. Military cadence. This is not a drill. We need Monica Stewart to report to the roof access immediately. Monica Stewart, report to roof access now. The hallway went silent except for the rotors thundering overhead. Every face turned, searching for someone they didn't know, looking for whoever this Monica Stewart was. Monica pressed herself back against the wall, her bag sliding off her shoulder, hitting the floor with a soft thump. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But then the stairwell door at the end of the hallway burst open, and soldiers poured through. 6 of them, full tactical gear, moving with the kind of precision that comes from training and combat and missions where hesitation gets you killed. They spread out immediately, scanning faces, searching. Monica's legs locked. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except watch as one of them, the tallest, turned his head and locked eyes with her across 30 feet of hospital corridor. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly who she was. His gaze pinned her in place like a specimen under glass, and as he started moving toward her, she saw it. The patch on his shoulder. Worn fabric, faded colors, a design she'd seen on uniforms and body bags and in nightmares she couldn't outrun. A falcon in flight, 9 stars arranged in a V formation below it. Falcon 9, the unit that had died in Basra, the unit she'd served with. The unit that officially no longer existed because the mission had been scrubbed from every record, every file, every acknowledgement that they'd ever been sent into that hell in the first place. The last time she'd seen that patch, it had been soaked in blood. The last time she'd seen those colors, she'd been counting bodies and trying to save the ones who were still screaming. Half the people wearing that patch had died in the desert. The other half had scattered to the wind, bound by non-disclosure agreements and the kind of trauma that made you disappear into civilian life and never look back. So why was it here now? Why was it walking toward her down a hospital hallway in a city that should have been safe, should have been far enough away from everything she'd left behind? The soldier stopped 3 feet in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was respectful but absolutely unyielding. "We need you to come with us." Right now? Monica's back was against the wall. Her bag was at her feet. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to refuse, to stay in the life she'd built where she was just a nurse who'd been fired for saving a life. But some part of her, the part that had never really left the desert, was already calculating, already understanding. Falcon 9 didn't show up for nothing. Falcon 9 didn't mobilize 2 Black Hawks and stage a tactical insertion at a civilian hospital because someone needed a consultation. Someone was dying, and they thought she was the only one who could stop it. If you think she should ignore them and walk away, comment "Stay civilian." If you think she has no choice but to go, comment Falcon 9. Because what Monica decides in the next 10 seconds will change everything. The question is whether she's ready to become the person she used to be. The person she spent 8 years trying to forget. Let's see where you stand. The interior of the Black Hawk was all business. No cushioned seats, no pretense of comfort. Just jump seats bolted to the frame and the overwhelming thunder of rotors that made conversation nearly impossible without the headset they'd shoved into Monica's hands the moment she'd climbed aboard. She sat wedged between 2 young soldiers who couldn't have been more than 25, both of them stealing glances at her like she was something between a legend and a ghost. Their uniforms were pristine, their faces still carrying that earnest intensity of people who hadn't yet learned what war actually cost. The tall soldier who'd found her in the hallway sat directly across from her, close enough that their knees almost touched. He'd introduced himself as Sergeant First Class Marcus Carver, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that only came from seeing too much. He pulled out a tablet, angling it so she could see the screen over the noise and vibration. "We don't have much time, ma'am, so I'm going to be direct. Colonel James Rafe is critical. Shrapnel lodged near the heart, bleeding we can't control. Our medics have tried everything conventional. He's got maybe 6 hours." Monica stared at the name on the screen. Rafe. The man she'd pulled back from death in a dusty compound 8 years ago. The man whose blood had soaked through her gloves while she'd worked with shaking hands and absolute certainty. "Colonel Rafe is alive?" Her voice came out hoarse, nearly swallowed by the helicopter's roar. Carver nodded. "Alive, ma'am. Because of you. And he needs you again." The helicopter banked hard, and Monica's stomach dropped. Outside the window, the city was falling away, replaced by darkness and distance. They were heading east, moving fast, and she hadn't even agreed to come. Hadn't even asked where they were taking her. But her hands were already remembering. Already running through procedures she hadn't performed in nearly a decade. Already calculating angles and pressures and the narrow margin between saving a life and ending one. Basra had been fire and chaos from the moment they'd inserted. Intelligence had promised a quick extraction of a high-value informant. Instead, Falcon 9 had walked into an ambush so perfectly orchestrated it could only have been a betrayal from the inside. Monica remembered the taste of dust, the way it coated your throat until you couldn't tell if you were breathing or drowning. She remembered the crack of gunfire echoing off compound walls, the screams of men who'd been her brothers, the way time stretched and compressed until every second felt like drowning and every minute lasted hours. Colonel Rafe had been leading point when the IED detonated. Not a roadside bomb, something worse. A building rig designed to collapse the entire structure. Monica had been 30 yards back when the world turned orange and white, when the shockwave threw her against a wall hard enough to crack ribs. When the dust cleared, half her unit was gone. Just gone. Vaporized or buried under rubble that would take days to clear. The ones who survived were screaming, bleeding, going into shock. Rafe had been conscious, barely. Shrapnel had torn through his chest, missing his heart by centimeters, but shredding everything around it. His left lung was collapsing. Blood was filling his chest cavity. The medevac helicopters were 15 minutes out, which might as well have been 15 hours. Monica had looked at her commanding officer, at this man who'd trained her and trusted her and led them into this hell, and she'd made a decision that had no room for doubt. She'd improvised. Took a collapsed lung technique she'd learned in training, combined it with field cauterization methods that weren't in any manual, and essentially rewrote the rules of combat medicine on the fly. She'd used a chest tube and her own fingers to clear the blood, cauterized bleeders with a field tool that was meant for sealing equipment, not human tissue. She'd kept him breathing through sheer stubborn will, talking to him the entire time, telling him he wasn't allowed to die. Not here, not like this. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. By the time the helicopters arrived, Rafe's vitals had stabilized. He'd lived. So had 3 others she'd gotten to in time. 4 men who should have died in the desert came home because Monica Stewart had refused to accept that conventional medicine had limits. But when they'd gotten back to base, when she'd filed her report detailing exactly what she'd done and how she'd done it, something had shifted. Command had buried it. Buried the mission, buried the ambush, buried the intelligence failure that had gotten half of Falcon 9 killed. Her report disappeared. Her procedure was never acknowledged. And when she'd pushed, when she demanded answers about why good soldiers had been sent into a trap, she'd been given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Take an honorable discharge. Sign an NDA. Disappear into civilian life with a clean record and a story about wanting to pursue other opportunities. Or face a court-martial for insubordination, have her career destroyed, and still never get answers because the mission was classified above her pay grade. Monica had been 26 years old, exhausted, traumatized, and smart enough to know when she'd already lost. So she'd signed. She'd separated. She'd erased herself. She didn't run from the military. The military erased her because she'd been inconvenient evidence of their failure. Carver was watching her face, reading the memories there. "Ma'am," he said quietly, leaning closer so she could hear him over the rotors. "The procedure you invented that day? It's been saving lives for 8 years. Field medics across 4 theaters use it. It's part of standard training now for special operations units." Monica's breath caught. "They teach it?" Carver nodded. "They call it the Rafe Protocol. Named it after the colonel because officially, that's who developed it. Your name isn't in any of the documentation. Your contribution was classified, buried, like you said. But Colonel Rafe never forgot. He's been looking for you ever since. Tried to get your records unsealed, tried to get you reinstated, tried to get you the recognition you deserved." The helicopter shuddered through turbulence, and Monica felt 8 years of anger and grief rising in her throat like bile. "They took my procedure and gave someone else credit." Carver's jaw tightened. "Yes, ma'am. And I'm not going to tell you that's right, because it's not. But I am going to tell you that the Rafe Protocol has saved 247 lives that we know of. Combat medics who would have watched their brothers die now have a chance. And every single one of those saves traces back to what you did in Basra." Monica closed her eyes, feeling the helicopter's vibration through her bones. 247 lives. People who went home to families, who got to grow old, who got to live because she'd refused to let Rafe die in the dust. It didn't erase the betrayal. Didn't make up for the erasure or the lies or the years she'd spent hiding from a past that wasn't even acknowledged. But it meant something. Had to mean something. And now Rafe was dying again. And they'd come for her, because conventional medicine had failed and desperate times required the person who invented miracles in the desert. Carver pulled up another screen on the tablet, showing her preliminary scans and field reports. I won't lie to you, ma'am. This is bad. Worse than Basra in some ways. The shrapnel is lodged in a position that makes standard extraction impossible. Our surgeons say attempting removal will kill him. Not attempting it will also kill him. We need someone who thinks outside the protocols. Someone who's done the impossible before. Monica opened her eyes and looked at the young soldiers sitting beside her, at Carver's weathered face, at the Falcon 9 patches they all wore like promises. She thought about the hospital she'd just left, about being fired for trusting her instincts, about a system that punished people for saving lives. And she thought about Rafe, about the man who'd apparently spent 8 years trying to find her, trying to make things right. How long until we arrive? She asked. Carver checked his watch. 4 hours to the forward operating base. Monica nodded once, settling back into the uncomfortable seat. Then brief me on everything. His vitals, the trajectory of the shrapnel, what's been attempted and why it failed. I need to know exactly what I'm walking into. Carver's face split into something that might have been relief or respect or both. Yes, ma'am. And ma'am? Thank you. Monica didn't respond. She just pulled the tablet toward her and started reading, her mind already shifting into that cool analytical space where doubt didn't exist and impossible was just another word for a problem that hadn't been solved yet. The helicopter carried her east through the darkness, back toward a world she'd thought she'd escaped, back toward the man she'd saved once before, back toward the part of herself she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. Almost, but not quite, because some things you can't ever really leave behind. Some debts follow you no matter how far you run. And sometimes, the world doesn't let you stay hidden when people are dying and you're the only one who knows how to save them. The Black Hawk touched down with a jolt that rattled Monica's teeth. The rear door slid open before the rotors had even begun to slow, and the smell hit her first. Diesel fuel, burning trash, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of blood mixed with desert dust. The smell of a place where people were fighting to stay alive. This wasn't a hospital. The forward operating base spread out before her in a maze of canvas tents, concrete barriers, and temporary structures thrown together in hours. Floodlights cast harsh shadows across everything. Wounded soldiers on stretchers. Medics running between tents with bags of blood and equipment. The controlled chaos of a place understaffed, undersupplied, and dealing with more casualties than it was built to handle. This was a conflict zone. Active combat. She'd been pulled out of a civilian hospital and dropped into a war that apparently hadn't ended just because she'd stopped fighting it. Carver led her through checkpoints, past triage areas filled with wounded soldiers and exhausted medics. Then Monica saw them. 2 medics working on a chest wound, their hands moving in practiced synchronization. The woman looked up, probably annoyed at someone blocking the walkway. Her eyes found Monica's face, and every muscle went rigid. She dropped the bandage she was holding. Oh my God. Sergeant Lydia Torres. Staff Sergeant David Park. Both Falcon 9. Both people she'd thought she'd never see again. People who probably thought she was dead. Stewart? Park's voice cracked on her name. Torres crossed the distance in 3 strides, grabbing Monica's shoulders like she needed to confirm she was real. We thought. We heard you'd. Her voice failed. Monica's throat was too tight to speak. Torres pulled her into a fierce hug that smelled like antiseptic and sweat and home. We tried to find you, Park said quietly when they separated. Monica shook her head. I signed an NDA. Wasn't supposed to contact anyone from the unit. His jaw tightened with understanding. Of course they made you sign. The critical tent was smaller, more isolated. Inside, medical equipment lined the walls, most of it field-grade but functional. And in the center, on a table that had seen dozens of impossible cases, lay Colonel James Rafe. He looked older. Gray hair, lines carved deep into his face. But his eyes, when they opened and found her, were exactly the same. Sharp. Aware. Fighting. You came, he managed, his voice barely a whisper. Monica moved to the table without conscious thought, reaching for his chart. The medical team stepped back, giving her space, watching with desperate hope. They'd run out of options. They were putting all their faith in a woman who hadn't practiced combat medicine in nearly a decade. She scanned the chart, the monitors, the scans they'd managed to take. Her heart sank. The shrapnel had shifted. It was pressing against his heart in a completely different position than what Carver had shown her on the helicopter. The RAFE protocol wouldn't work. The procedure she'd invented was designed for a specific type of injury in a specific location. This was different. This would require her to improvise again, to adapt on the fly, to essentially invent a new procedure with a man's life hanging in the balance. And she hadn't done this in 8 years. Rafe's eyes were still open, still watching her. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. "Knew you wouldn't let me die a second time." The medical team pressed closer, their faces showing desperate hope. She had two choices. Walk away from the past she'd spent a decade burying, from the trauma and the betrayal and the nightmares. Or step back into the nightmare that made her. Step back into being the combat medic who invented miracles, who saved lives in impossible circumstances, who carried the burden of being the one everyone turned to when conventional medicine failed. If you believe some skills are too important to bury, that some debts can only be repaid by walking back into the fire you escaped from, hit that subscribe button. Because what Monica does next doesn't just save a life. It rewrites the book on emergency medicine. It proves that some people are forged in circumstances so extreme that they become irreplaceable. Monica set the chart down and began rolling up her sleeves. "Someone get me scrubbed in," she said quietly. "And find me everything you have that can work as a precision cauterization tool. We're not doing the RAFE protocol today. We're inventing something new." The medical team erupted into motion. Rafe's eyes closed, relief visible even through the pain. And Monica stepped back into the role she'd sworn she'd never play again, knowing that this time, there might not be any coming back from it. Monica's hands moved with a precision that surprised even her. 8 years away from combat medicine, and her fingers still remembered the rhythm, the pressure, the exact angle needed to navigate tissue that was more scar than structure. She'd scrubbed in quickly, her mind already compartmentalizing everything that wasn't the work in front of her. The tent, the war outside, the faces of people she'd thought she'd never see again. All of it disappeared the moment she made the first incision. The shrapnel was lodged between Rafe's 4th and 5th ribs, pressed so close to his heart that every beat was essentially pushing against a blade. Conventional extraction would require stopping the heart, putting him on bypass, and they didn't have that equipment here. They barely had enough to keep him breathing. So Monica did what she'd always done. She improvised. Her thought process unfolded in layers. First, stabilize the immediate bleed. The shrapnel had nicked the pericardium, the sac around the heart, and fluid was accumulating. She needed to drain it without causing more damage. Her hands worked while her mind calculated angles, remembered anatomy, adapted techniques she'd learned for completely different injuries. This wasn't the RAFE protocol. This was something new. A combination of cardiac window procedure, modified thoracotomy approach, and field innovation that didn't have a name yet because no one had been desperate or crazy enough to try it. The young medics watching from the edge of the tent were taking notes, their faces showing a mixture of awe and disbelief. Torres stood at Monica's right shoulder, anticipating instruments before Monica asked for them, the muscle memory of their old partnership clicking back into place like they'd never been apart. Park monitored vitals, calling out numbers in a steady voice that kept everyone grounded. Then Rafe crashed. His heart rhythm went chaotic, the monitor screaming in sustained alarm. Monica didn't hesitate. "Charging," she called out, and someone slapped the defibrillator paddles into her waiting hands. Clear. The shock jolted through Rafe's body. Nothing. Again. Clear. This time the rhythm caught, stuttered, then steadied into something that looked almost normal. Monica's hands were back in his chest before the relief could even register. She had maybe 3 minutes before it happened again. She worked faster, using a field cauterization tool that was never designed for cardiac tissue, adapting pressure and duration through pure instinct. The shrapnel was shifting with each heartbeat, a deadly pendulum that could slice through the heart wall at any moment. She needed to stabilize it before extraction, needed to create a buffer between metal and muscle. Her mind raced through options, discarded most of them, landed on something she'd seen once in a surgical journal about using biological mesh as reinforcement. "We don't have mesh," she said quietly. Torres was already moving. "We have combat gauze." The hemostatic kind. Monica nodded. That'll work. Bring me 3 packs. What she was about to do wasn't in any textbook. She was going to create a cushion using the gauze, position it between the shrapnel and the heart wall, then extract the metal in a single smooth motion. If she miscalculated by even a millimeter, Rafe would bleed out in seconds. He crashed again. Longer this time. Monica had to stop her work, pull back, let Park and Torres take over compressions while she recharged the paddles. Rafe's face was gray, his lips turning blue. Clear. The shock. Nothing. Clear. Again. Finally, impossibly, his heart found its rhythm. Monica's hands were shaking now, adrenaline and exhaustion making her fingers tremble. But when she went back in, they steadied. Muscle memory overriding everything else. As she worked, Rafe's eyes fluttered open. He was barely conscious. Shouldn't have been conscious at all given the anesthesia, but pain and determination kept him hovering at the edge. "Stuart," he whispered, his voice so faint she almost missed it. "I tried to find you." Monica didn't look away from her work. "I know, Colonel." His breathing was labored, each word costing him. "They buried everything. Your name, your work. I tried, for 8 years, try to make them." She positioned the gauze with infinite care, creating the buffer she needed. "You're still breathing, Colonel," she said quietly. "That's acknowledgement enough." The extraction took 7 seconds. 7 seconds where everyone in the tent held their breath. 7 seconds where Monica's entire world narrowed to the feel of metal sliding through tissue, the resistance of muscle, the terrible possibility of catastrophic bleed. Then it was out. The shrapnel came free in one piece, and Monica was already moving, packing the wound, cauterizing, closing layers with sutures that would hold until he could get to a real surgical facility. The monitors steadied, blood pressure climbing, heart rhythm strong and regular, oxygen saturation improving. Monica tied off the final suture and stepped back, pulling off her gloves with hands that were suddenly shaking violently. The tent stayed silent for a long moment, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then Torres let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. Park wiped his eyes. The young medics looked like they'd just watched someone walk on water. Carver approached carefully, like he was worried about disturbing something sacred. "Ma'am," he said softly, "we need to document this. For training purposes. For the other field units. What do we call it?" Monica looked at Rafe, at his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, at the man who'd spent 8 years trying to give her credit she'd never received. She thought about the hospital that had fired her for trusting her instincts, about the military that had erased her, about all the ways the world tried to make people smaller than they were. "Call it what it is," she said, exhaustion making her voice rough. "The Stuart method." The tent erupted in quiet relief. Medics moving to clean up, to transfer Rafe to recovery, to document every step of what Monica had done. Torres gripped her shoulder, pride and grief mixed in her expression. Park nodded once, a gesture of respect that needed no words. Monica walked out of the tent into the desert night, pulled off her surgical cap, and let the cold air hit her face. She'd saved him again, invented another procedure that would probably save hundreds more, proven that she was exactly as good as she'd always known she was. But the cost of coming back, of stepping into this world again, was about to get a lot more complicated, because now they knew where she was. Now they knew what she could do. And people who could do the impossible were never allowed to simply walk away. She'd saved Rafe's life twice now. The question was whether she'd just saved her own future or signed away any chance of ever being free again. 3 days after saving Colonel Rafe's life for the second time, Monica Stuart returned to the United States expecting nothing. She'd been flown back on a military transport, thanked formally by officers whose names she didn't catch, and deposited at an airfield outside Washington with a handshake and what felt like a dismissal. She'd done what they'd asked. Saved the man who needed saving. Now she'd go back to being unemployed, jobless, just another nurse who'd been fired for doing the right thing. She took a cab to her apartment, a small one-bedroom in a neighborhood that was affordable because it was forgettable. Climbed the stairs with her duffel bag over her shoulder, keys already in her hand. But when she reached her floor, 2 men in dress uniforms were standing outside her door. Not threatening, just waiting. One of them stepped forward as she approached. "Miss Stuart, we need you to come with us, please." Monica's exhaustion crystallized into wariness. Am I under arrest? No, ma'am. But there are people who need to speak with you. Important people. She thought about refusing, about demanding explanations, about all the ways this could be another trap. But something in the soldier's face told her this wasn't a request she could decline. She dropped her duffel inside her apartment and followed them down to a black SUV that looked like every government vehicle she'd ever seen. They drove her to a building she didn't recognize, all concrete and security checkpoints, and the kind of oppressive silence that comes from places where serious decisions get made. She was escorted through corridors, past offices with closed doors, until they reached a briefing room that was far too large for what she'd expected. A conference table that could seat 20. High-ranking officers already seated, their uniforms bearing stars and insignia that represented decades of service. And on the wall, multiple video screens showing Pentagon officials in their own secure locations. Monica stood at the entrance, suddenly aware of how she must look. 3 days of combat zone dust still in her hair. Wrinkled civilian clothes. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from saving lives and inventing procedures and facing down demons she'd thought were buried. A 2-star general stood from his seat at the head of the table. He was older, silver-haired, with a face that had clearly seen combat and command. "Ms. Stewart," he said, his voice carrying the weight of formality and something that sounded almost like shame. "On behalf of the United States Armed Forces, we owe you an apology 8 years overdue." Monica felt the floor shift beneath her feet. An apology? From a general? In a room full of people who represented the institution that had erased her. "Please sit," he continued, gesturing to a chair that had been left empty at the table. Monica sat, mostly because her legs weren't sure they'd keep holding her up. The general remained standing. 8 years ago, you served with distinction as a combat medic in Basra. You performed an emergency procedure that saved the life of Colonel James Rafe and 3 other soldiers. You filed a report detailing your methods, your innovation, your success. That report was suppressed by command as part of a cover-up of an intelligence failure that got good soldiers killed. He paused, and Monica could see the careful consideration in his words. "We cannot undo that injustice. We cannot give you back 8 years. But we can tell you the truth. Colonel Rafe never stopped fighting for you. He leaked your original report to the right people, bypassed chains of command, risked his own career to make sure your work was recognized. The procedure you invented, the one we covered up, has been taught to special operations medics for the past 6 years." The general nodded to someone at the far end of the table, and a presentation screen lit up with statistics. "The Stewart method, as it's now officially designated, has saved 247 lives across 4 conflict zones. Combat medics in situations where conventional evacuation isn't possible, where field conditions are extreme, where soldiers would have died without immediate intervention. Your innovation has become standard doctrine. You have saved more lives than most career military surgeons." Monica stared at the numbers on the screen. 247. Each one a person who went home. Each one a family that didn't get the worst knock on their door. Each one a debt she hadn't known she was owed. The general sat down, his expression serious. "We are offering you full reinstatement, Miss Stewart. Rank of captain, back pay for the 8 years you should have been serving, and a position as Chief Medical Innovation Officer. You would be responsible for developing new field medical protocols, training the next generation of combat medics, and ensuring that what happened to you never happens to anyone else." It was everything. Recognition, vindication, a career that would let her do what she was best at without civilian bureaucracy getting in the way. Monica opened her mouth to respond, but movement at the corner of the room caught her attention. Another man was standing, and when he turned to face the table, Monica's breath caught in her throat. Director Richard Pemberton, from Mercy Heights Hospital, the man who'd fired her 3 days ago. He looked shaken, pale, diminished in a room full of military authority. He cleared his throat, his confidence from that morning in his office completely absent. "Miss Stewart, we had no idea about your background, your service, your contributions. Mercy Heights would like to offer you reinstatement with a significant promotion. Head of Emergency Medicine, full administrative authority, whatever you need to continue your work." Monica stared at him, at this man who'd called her reckless, who'd told her that instincts didn't override protocol, who'd fired her for saving a life. Now he was here, surrounded by generals and Pentagon officials, trying to save face, trying to claim association with someone who'd just been revealed as extraordinary. The room had gone quiet, everyone watching to see how she'd respond. If you can't stand bullies in positions of power, people who punish competence and then try to take credit when the truth comes out, then you understand what Monica felt looking at Pemberton. Comment justice served, because this man is about to learn a lesson he'll never forget. About what it means to recognize value only when everyone else does. About what it costs to throw away people who know more than you do. About the difference between authority and leadership. Monica stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Pemberton's face. She could see him sweating now, could see the desperation of a man who'd realized he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The general and the other officers waited, respectful of whatever she was about to say. This was her moment, the reckoning she'd never expected to have. The choice between returning to a world that had finally recognized her worth, or walking away from all of it on her own terms. And what she said next would determine not just her future, but the message sent to every other person who'd ever been punished for being right. Pemberton was still talking, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to make amends. We had no idea about your background, Miss Stewart, your military service, your innovations. Mercy Heights would be honored to have you back. We'd like to offer you a position as head of emergency medicine, full administrative authority, whatever resources you need to continue your groundbreaking work. Monica cut him off. Her voice was calm, controlled, carrying none of the anger he probably expected. You fired me for saving a life. Called me reckless. Told me my instincts didn't override hospital protocol. She took a step toward him, and Pemberton actually backed up slightly. Now you want me back because someone else validated what I already knew. That's not respect, Director Pemberton. That's fear. Fear that you made a mistake everyone will remember. Fear that the hospital will look incompetent for throwing away someone who turned out to be extraordinary. Fear that matters more to you than the patient who's alive because I didn't wait for your protocols. The room was absolutely silent. Pemberton opened his mouth, closed it, had nothing to say that wouldn't make things worse. Monica turned away from him, dismissing him as thoroughly as he'd dismissed her 3 days ago. She faced the two-star general and the officers who'd offered her everything she thought she wanted. I appreciate the honor, she said quietly. I appreciate the apology, the recognition, the opportunity. But I'm not coming back to active duty. Every person in the room froze. The general's expression shifted from respect to confusion. Miss Stewart, may I ask why? His voice was careful, genuinely trying to understand. Monica took a breath, choosing her words with the same precision she used when making surgical incisions. Because there are 1,000 nurses out there just like me. Brilliant, brave, capable of extraordinary things. And they're all being ignored by systems that value credentials over competence, protocols over lives, institutional protection over doing what's right. She looked around the room at the faces watching her. I'm going to train them. Teach them that their instincts matter, that innovation isn't recklessness, that saving lives sometimes means breaking rules written by people who've never had to make life or death decisions. I'm going to make sure nobody ever has to prove their worth the way I did. Nobody should have to be erased and then resurrected just to be acknowledged. The general studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. That's a mission worth serving, Ms. Stewart. We'll support it however we can. Monica nodded back, a gesture of mutual respect between people who understood what service actually meant. Then she walked out of the briefing room, past Pemberton who looked like he'd been hollowed out, past the officers and the officials and the apologies that came 8 years too late. She turned down the Pentagon, walked away from rank and recognition and a career that would have made her powerful. But what she built next changed emergency medicine forever. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do isn't join the system that finally accepts you. Sometimes it's build something new for everyone the system left behind. 6 months later, Monica Stewart stood in front of a packed auditorium that held 200 faces, all of them looking at her like she held answers they'd been searching for their entire careers. Military medics in uniform sat beside civilian nurses in scrubs. Paramedics from fire departments mixed with doctors from rural hospitals. Young and old, experienced and fresh out of training, all of them united by a single understanding. The system they worked in wasn't built for the reality they faced. Monica wore simple clothes, jeans, and a button-down shirt. No rank insignia or credentials displayed. Behind her on the wall hung a single framed item. The Falcon 9 patch, its Falcon in flight, and 9 stars still visible despite the faded fabric. And beneath it, added in careful lettering, Captain Monica Stewart, Combat Medic, Innovator. The name that had been erased for 8 years, now permanently displayed for everyone who walked into this room. What you're about to learn isn't in any textbook, Monica said, her voice carrying easily through the space. It's not approved by medical boards or sanctioned by hospital administrators. It exists because people were dying and conventional medicine had no answers. She moved across the stage, her hands gesturing as she spoke. The Stewart method is now taught in 40 countries. It's saved over 500 lives in situations where evacuation wasn't possible, where equipment was limited, where the choice was innovate or watch someone die. And it started with a nurse they called Reckless. The audience leaned forward, notebooks open, ready to absorb everything she offered. Monica spent the next 3 hours teaching them not just procedures, but philosophy, how to trust the knowledge that lived in their hands, how to read a patient's body when monitors failed, how to make decisions in seconds that textbooks said required committees. She taught them the original RAFE protocol, then walked them through how she'd adapted it in the field, how necessity had forced evolution. She taught them to think like innovators instead of technicians. During the break, young medics approached her with questions that went beyond technique. How do you deal with administration that doesn't understand? How do you trust yourself when everyone says you're wrong? How do you carry the weight of making life or death decisions? Monica answered each question with honesty earned through experience. You deal with it by knowing that the patient's life matters more than your career. You trust yourself by doing the work, practicing until your hands remember even when your mind doubts. And you carry the weight by understanding that choosing to act, even imperfectly, is better than choosing safety while someone dies. When the day ended and the auditorium finally emptied, Monica returned to the small office she'd claimed in the building that housed her new training center. It wasn't fancy, just a desk and filing cabinets and a window that looked out over the city. On her desk sat the day's mail, mostly administrative documents and requests for speaking engagements. But one envelope stood out, hand-addressed, military postmark. She opened it carefully and recognized the handwriting immediately. Colonel Rafe's letter was brief, written with the economy of a soldier who'd learned that words mattered most when you didn't waste them. Monica, I'm retiring next month. 28 years of service, and I'm finally hanging it up. But I'm not done yet. You're building something important, something that's going to change how we think about emergency medicine. I'd like to help if you'll have me. I owe you 2 lives now, mine twice over. Let me spend the rest of my career making sure other people get the same chance. He'd signed it simply, Rafe. Monica smiled, a genuine expression that softened the intensity she usually carried. She pulled out a piece of paper and wrote her response in the same direct style. Welcome to the team, soldier. We start Monday. Bring your stories and your scars. We're teaching people how to save lives, and you've got 8 years of lessons I could use. She signed it Stewart, sealed the envelope, and set it aside for mailing. As she gathered her things to leave, a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors cutting through the evening air. Monica paused at the window, looking up at the silhouette against the sunset sky. 6 months ago, that sound would have sent her heart racing, would have triggered memories of dust and blood and the feeling of running from a past that wouldn't stay buried. Now she just watched it pass, a reminder of where she'd been and what she'd survived and what she'd built from the ashes of erasure. Sometimes the world doesn't recognize a hero until it has no choice. Until the evidence becomes so overwhelming, the lives saved so numerous, the innovation so undeniable that institutions have to acknowledge what they tried to bury. And sometimes, the hero doesn't need recognition at all. Sometimes they just need the freedom to do the work that matters, to train the next generation, to make sure that competence and courage aren't punished but celebrated. Monica Stewart had been fired for saving a life, had been erased by the military for being inconveniently right, had been forgotten by a system that valued control over excellence. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd just been waiting for the moment when the world needed her badly enough to come looking. And when it did, when those helicopters landed and dragged her back into the nightmare she'd escaped, She'd proven that some people are irreplaceable. Some skills are too important to bury. And some debts can only be repaid by refusing to let the system win. If Monica's story proves that the system doesn't get the final say, that being fired or erased or dismissed doesn't define your worth, drop a never quit in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been told they're too much or not enough or too reckless when they were really just being brave. And if you believe in honoring the people who save lives in silence, who innovate in impossible circumstances, who refuse to let protocols matter more than people, then subscribe. Because these are the stories we're here to tell. The stories of people who were dismissed and then proved indispensable. The stories that remind us that sometimes the person everyone underestimated turns out to be exactly the hero we needed all along.